I could not be more excited for y'all to see this video. Bring on Scott Connor here, host of Dynasty and Chill podcast. I'm going to link everything that he does down in the description. I truly mean it. He's a lot smarter than me. That's why we brought him on. Please stick to the end of the video. Make sure that you get the full benefit of this in-depth talk about roster construction, specifically at the very end of your roster. But before we dive into it, of course, this is brought to you by Underdog Fantasy. On Underdog Fantasy, you've seen it every day. We're live streaming. We are drafting every single day. Go have some fun. Sign up with promo code FLOCK. You'll get my rankings. You'll get my Dynasty rankings. You'll get my Dynasty rookie draft guide. And they will also match your first deposit dollar for dollar up to 100. Drop a like, subscribe. You know what to do. Please enjoy this video and make sure you watch to the end because I know it's going to help a ton. I am very excited to get this going. Brought on someone that is way smarter than me and way more Dynasty leagues than me. Y'all have seen him on the channel I don't know how many times before. And we're going to be talking about some strategy with your roster construction, specifically at the very end of your roster. What you're doing with players like we were talking right before this. James Washington, Scott's coming out here saying that he has no reason at all to be rostering those players. They are a hindrance to his actual team. He's going through cutting them, flipping any late rookie running back that he had for possibly a future second-round pick, regardless where it come from. I mean, I'm just going to sit back, let you do all the heavy lifting as usual because you are smarter than me. Take it away wherever you want to go from here.
Yeah, well, thanks for the intro. Glad to be back on the channel. We were trying to figure out when the last time was that we recorded together. It was probably 2 years ago, maybe 2.5 years ago. Yeah, pre-COVID. It's been a while. But yeah, I mean, you reached out and you're like, yeah, let's just catch up and talk about some topics that are passionate. And that's one thing that has come up recently is I've basically become, anyone that's followed me over the years, everyone knows I've played in a lot of leagues and typically take like a portfolio approach, but I've really become robotic with how I play Dynasty. And it doesn't sound fun. It doesn't sound like, sometimes I wonder, is this actually something that I enjoy as a hobby? And I love it. Don't get me wrong. But it's forced me to become a lot more data-driven and really robotic with how I manage teams. So I guess we get into the James Washington thing. He was just a random player. Like, you asked me for an example of how I was articulating this subject. And so I had a league where basically I have James Washington, and he's probably my 9th or 10th receiver, and it's one of those where the idea was if I can't get even a 4th-round pick for him, and it has nothing to do with I saw he was spotted in a walking boot in OTAs. Like, I don't even care about that. I literally couldn't get anything that I felt was more valuable than a roster spot. And so I went through and I just cut him. And it's almost like a freeing feeling, you know what I mean? Because it's like I'm sitting here trying to send out James Washington for a 4th-round pick, and nobody's accepting the deal. So I just cut him. And the reason behind it is simply like, that just tells me that he's not really worth a roster spot. And in a way, I'm doing two things. I'm freeing up a roster spot for me. The way I build my teams is I'm always trying to maximize my roster construction first and foremost. And we'll get into what I think is optimal based on your settings. But the second thing was I already know someone else is going to pick them up. And so that in itself brings on a detriment, I think, to another roster. So we're talking maybe like a 0.5% advantage swing there for me, freeing up a roster spot, and then somebody else adds a guy like James Washington. But that's it. Like, just one simple move. And I don't think people think about that often. They kind of just look at players and they say, well, what's the range of outcomes for James Washington? Well, I can squint and he could be a wide receiver 4, maybe that draft capital that was 5 years ago comes back up and now he's on Dallas. Maybe he's the number 3 option there. And Mason, he could finish like wide receiver 50, dude. Like, I can't keep him. But then you realize, like, how is it ever going to fit in non-best ball, right? I know you're a best ball guy. Non-best ball.
What's really funny is I had a question that was almost exactly this morning by someone, Fantasy Clown. I know a lot of people, part of the flock, know him. Very similar to you. I'll say he has a much larger issue. I think he's in like 90 or 100 leagues. Don't know how he does it. But he messaged saying, with roster cut downs, should you go through and should you start cutting players now to prepare for maybe how you have to have your final cut down at the end of July? And I was saying, there's no reason in hell to go through and ever cut a player without having a plan to either go and trade a stud for 2 pieces in return, so you need the roster spot, or you see someone else on the waiver wire. So I understand maybe you're going through the range of outcomes and saying, hell, even if Jalen Tolbert amounts to nothing, even if somehow James Washington seeing snaps at the beginning of the season with Michael Gallup gone, I don't see it in the range of outcomes for him to ever be able to fetch me a third-round rookie pick. Like, obviously, it's just one example, and we're more so talking about the strategy here. But when you move on from a depth wide receiver like that is providing you absolutely nothing immediately, what's your plan with that roster spot at this point of the offseason? Like, are you going and just reading RotoViz nonstop, RotoWorld nonstop, and trying to find the next UDFA that's going to somehow step an opportunity where you can potentially flip them for a second-round pick? Like, what's the end game here if we're going to create roster spots this early in the offseason?
Yeah, that's a good question. And I think the James Washington part is he's probably seen to a lot of people as, even in a 25-man roster, 28-man roster league, like he's seen as somebody that's worth a roster spot, especially because he has a new situation. It's a new team. It's a new offense. It's a new quarterback. Like everything you would say, you want to wait and see what happens with him to start the season, right? Like you can argue all of that. So I think he's a really good example as like an extreme. Like this is going to the extreme. Now, a lot of these other examples are, well, that guy probably wouldn't even be worth a roster spot anyway. So you cut him now, big deal. You're going to probably be able to replace him with a better player on the
exactly, like
wire.
Auden Tate.
Yeah, and there's a ton of receivers. Honestly, if you look at the last couple of years, we're talking over 100 receivers have produced top 12 weeks, 1 week, right? So we have lingering receivers on tons of people's rosters, and I'm like, why are you really carrying like Laquan Treadwell at this point?
Yeah.
But you know what? It made sense to carry him in week 14 last year for a short period of time. But when you roll over, those are the kind of guys where if you cut him right now, I'm not going to be like, man, I don't know about that move. Like he could have some upside. You know what I mean? Like a guy like that, no, it doesn't matter. But James Washington, I can see some appeal. He was a high draft pick. You kind of look like he was always blocked in Pittsburgh. Like, okay, he went to a good landing spot. But I think the idea here is finding out, and this is league specific, so we're not going to be able to drill down, like, what is my exact strategy for every single person listening? But I think and I hope that it's someday we have this available in Dynasty. There's a lot of people that do good work on it, but I don't think it's like an all-encompassing tool that's available. But I really want to find a tool, and maybe it's something I need to look into. I don't have the ability to create it myself, but I have it in my mind, like what I would like to see. But basically a tool that just gives you a value of, a Dynasty roster with settings and lineups and rules. It's basically like one big math equation. Like think back to your college days when you had to take algebra, right? Like really complex algebra equations. There's always like a variable or 2 or 5 that you have to solve for, right? And that's all a Dynasty roster is. That's all a Dynasty league is. It's a system that's closed because there's rules, there's parameters, there's constraints. And then your team within the rules is just a math problem. And you have to figure out, like, what is each one of these components worth? Before you put the player in, what is the roster spot worth? What is this spot on my roster actually worth? So when you do that, I wish there was almost a way you could go into a startup draft and be like, this is the optimal build. This is the optimal template of how I'm going to build my team. And then with Dynasty, it's even more complex. I think we have some of these tools, like RotoViz has some of these tools. There's a lot of these type of tools that people use for best ball. But then you introduce Dynasty into it, where you have draft picks, you have players that are valued over multiple years. So you can take a snapshot and be like, yeah, in August of 2022, this is what the optimal should look like. It's going to look a lot like what a redraft team would. But then it's Dynasty. So there's a lot more components and a lot more variables that come into play. So it's really coming up with just understanding your league format, but then also catering that to what has worked historically over the last couple of years. I don't think we can go back like a decade, but if you just look at the last like 3 years or so of NFL results and you can see some trends, I think you can cater your roster construction perfectly. And when I mean perfectly, it's like down to the how many quarterbacks, how many running backs, how many receivers. When do I prioritize those positions? When do the bottom 5 roster spots want to be quarterbacks? When do they want to be running backs? When do I want to liquidate those? At what time during the season? And it changes. But just coming up with that system, understanding your format, and then just moving your roster construction to that. And if it's a league you've been in for 3 or 4 years, you're going to have some James Washingtons on your team. Nelson Aguilar is another one that I cut. He's probably an even more, I wouldn't say more severe example, but that's another guy where you're just kind of looking like, why do I have him on a team? You know what I mean? And So it's really getting it to the optimal roster construction for this specific league, in my opinion. And I have some ways to do that, but it's not like a tool I can give to anybody. So maybe we can have more discussion, but that's where my mindset's coming from.
So I understand the thought process and going through and saying, okay, this is what a roster spot's worth. In theory, if I could go through and if I could trade a roster spot, if I can accumulate these on the back end of my team, each roster spot's worth the 306. And of course, that's not accurate. I'm just throwing out something random. But if you have that baseline, what added benefit would you be getting from actually moving on from a player, quote unquote, too early rather than too late? So I still don't necessarily understand the end game here. Even if you go through and if we use an extreme example, Laquan Treadwell, nobody should have Laquan Treadwell on their team. But if we're looking at Laquan Treadwell and we don't necessarily see anybody that stands out through waivers, we don't have any trades lined up currently. What would be the plan to move on with Laquan Treadwell? That's step A. You run the sims, you run the calculations, and you realize, okay, a roster spot's worth $10. Laquan Treadwell is worth $8. He's not worth a roster spot. But everything else you're looking at the waiver wire is worth $6. Everything else you're looking through trade. I mean, your league's shut down for trades right now for whatever reason. Like, while yes, technically, if you go and get that roster spot, you're quote unquote profiting, but it's almost like the money is meaningless. It's almost like you have a gift card to Blockbuster. What are we going to do with it? So step A, move the player that's not worth the roster spot. But if you don't have an immediate step B, if you don't have that in plan, what are you doing from there?
No, it's a good question. And I think there's two answers to this. One is what I mentioned already before. Someone else will roster James Washington. So that's the first thing is not only do I not roster him, someone else will. I want somebody else to roster him. You know what I mean? To me, it's a negative value to have him on somebody else's roster, if that makes sense.
Yeah.
The other thing is right now, between Memorial Day weekend and the start of training camp, even into the preseason, this is the prime season to essentially, and this is something that I'm going to continue on during the year, but you maybe approach it a little bit different. This is the time of year to literally add, I think, any running back that is it's in a camp right now.
Okay.
I mean, there's guys that I'm going, I mean, that's largely what I'm doing. I'm going through, I'm picking up a lot of the UDFAs. And maybe this gets into their discussion on the running back class. There's a lot of running backs that came into the NFL this year. There's probably over 40 rookie running backs I'm interested in adding. Plus some other guys that are lingering out there that you're going, I can squint, maybe see a way they make the team. If you hit on a running back that makes a 53-man roster, okay, and now they have the NFL has the new taxi squad rules where they can expand it to 16 players. What you're going to see is you're going to typically see, this is something that we've seen over the last couple of years. Now, COVID is interesting because COVID has definitely impacted these rule changes, and it's impacted how NFL teams have managed their rosters as well. But you're going to see basically 4-man backfields with teams. And I think you're going to see them designed that way on purpose. It's going to be basically like a starter, whoever your starter is, whether you have an elite starter, just a average starter, or you don't really have a starter. You have some backfields where it's like, dude, they have like 4 guys, but none of them are really any good, right? And then you're going to have like the handcuff or the backup. And a lot of teams employ their handcuff as more of a true committee or a true platoon running back. Maybe they have a little bit of a different skill set. So think like Naheem Hines or J.D. McKissick or Kenneth Gainwell or someone like that. Those guys are valuable, but they're not necessarily somebody that has a lot of value, even if there's an injury. The value would have to be they just absorb more snaps, which results in more touches, which might result in more points. I see those guys as very valuable for best ball. Probably the better best ball bets if you go with a certain build. Those types are better in best ball because they don't really have like an accelerated value if there's an injury ahead of them. Then you have like the 3rd string running back or the other guy that's on the depth chart. He's usually, I remember hearing Daniel Jeremiah talking about this 2 years ago about what the new NFL backfield is going to look like. And he said the Saints, someone with the Saints organization brought this up to him. And they said, basically the new NFL backfield is your 3rd string running back or quote unquote, the 3rd running back is going to be a replica of your primary back, just not as good. There's a reason he's a number 3 and not a starter somewhere else. So those are the coveted spots that you want in terms of like the next man up or the handcuffs. But now we have these taxi squads, and you saw it last year with the Titans. Remember all the guys they had? They were carrying like Dontrell Hilliard and Deontay Foreman on their taxi squad behind Darrington Evans and behind Jeremy McNichols. And essentially they came up and filled those exact roles when there was injuries. And so I think you're going to see more teams doing that. So right now, what I'm trying to capture is all the guys that are going to be in those number 3 spots. That those are going to be the valuable handcuffs that are going to emerge midseason. I have no clue who they're going to be, but the trends from the last couple of years says there's probably going to be like 8 or so guys that come from that range. And a lot of them are probably going to be players that are already drafted, are already on rosters. But the idea is there's pretty much every single team's backfield is in flux at this point. So that's essentially what I'm doing with those roster spots. And the bet is, you know what? If I ever need to pick up a filler receiver or a filler tight end, like let's say we're in a 2 QB league or a 2 PPR tight end league, there's going to be filler tight ends and backup quarterbacks that I'm going to be interested in as the season comes up, right? So during the year, like you have some room to maybe roster the Jacoby Brissett's or Colt McCoy's or Gardner Minshew's or any backup quarterback that could maybe get a spot start. That's worth a roster spot during the season. When the season ends, none of those guys are worth carrying. They're dead weight. So yeah, there's only probably 5 backup quarterbacks or so that I want right now, but there's going to be ones on the waiver wire as we get to the season. So it's really just manipulating, and I'm casting a wide net here. I mean, you look at some of my rosters, 50% of my roster spots are running backs. And I know damn well that 20% of those guys or more are going to end up being cut, or they're going to be demoted to practice squads. But the ROI on hitting on one of those guys. So like, I'll give you an example, Deshaun Corbin on the Giants. No, he's basically available in any league that's more than probably 28 roster spots, 30 roster spots. They have Antonio Williams, they have Matt Breida, but he's one of those guys that if he emerges as like that 3rd guy on the active roster, that's worth way more than a filler receiver who's wide receiver 7 or wide receiver 6 ever would be. You get 1 start out of him in his career. It's well worth this time of spending the roster spot. And that's what I'm shooting for. Because a lot of my teams
so much more sense. Okay. This is laid out, I think, beautifully. Okay. So essentially, I completely agree with the quarterback as well, because with those quarterbacks, there's no scenario on planet Earth that you have Colt McCoy as the starter going into week 1. Even if the starter ahead of him goes down, the team's going to have the time to go and make a play for someone else. So I completely agree. Those guys just dead weight, move them off the roster. And also with wide receiver, I know a lot of people watching this are probably going to get just carried away with the names. They're going to be screaming, oh, what idiots, talking about dropping James White. It's more just about the idea behind it. And that if you look through the range of outcomes, those wide receivers, there's not a lot that could happen to change their situation to ever vault them up to being top 24 options that you can predict. Obviously, best ball, different. You can see those wide receivers spiking up and having 2 random touchdowns. But at running back, if you go through and if you load up on as many players that last year looked like Dearness Johnson as possible, you know when you're going to be able to start them going into the season. And also, you're going to be able to filter out all the training camp news. You're going to be able to look at the official depth charts going into the year. So if you go through and if you hoard the running backs at the very end of your roster now, then by the time we get closer to the season, we have a better idea what running backs are truly worthless, which the majority of them will be. You then move off of those players yet again and use those empty roster spots at that time to load up with spot quarterbacks or tight ends, depending on where the value lies.
Yeah, precisely. I mean, you nailed the quarterback thing, especially because, and this is a new phenomenon. This is something that I've kind of changed my tune in. And especially if you're in a league that has, I mean, if you're in a league with a lot of people that think in a similar way, and I do happen to be in a lot of leagues with people that I wouldn't say think exactly like me, but quite frankly, they probably listen to me. So they probably have picked up some things from me. And so in one hand, it's harder for me to kind of operate this way with those people. You know, they're not going to take a lot of my trades. They're not going to take a lot of my pivot trades where I'm doing 2-for-1s. I mean, I've talked about that forever, of doing the really strong 2-for-1s where basically you're coin flipping an RB2 because everyone else really loves J.K. Dobbins and everyone really hates like Miles Sanders. But the truth is they're probably a lot closer to finishing similar ranges to impact your team than a lot of people want to admit, but they're attached to the name. So you may be able to swing a deal where it's like you get Miles Sanders and a first for J.K. Dobbins. And I don't even care when the first is. The person taking J.K. Dobbins is probably making a really bad bet with that trade.
Yeah.
You know, so like, but a lot of people that I play with they've wised up into doing those trades. A lot of that stuff that I've been doing in years past doesn't work now. So I think this is one of those edges where when you're in sharper leagues, I've actually found this phenomenon the last 2 years, and maybe you've experienced the same thing. When you're in season, okay, and you want to buy a spot start at quarterback or running back. Those are the two spots where it's like, man, I'm pretty sure, like we all go through a process during the season. I know you do it. A lot of other people do it. Like Monday, Tuesday of the week before an NFL week, that's when you're starting to formulate what are my rankings going to look like. You're monitoring injury reports. But like once we get to like Thursday afternoon, we can pretty reasonably project what we think is going to happen. As close as we're going to be able to project it Sunday at 12:30 p.m. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
So like if there's a time to attack certain spots on your roster, it's then. And you've seen this phenomenon where there's a trade market that happens during the week. Hey, man, Alex Collins is starting this week. I'm so lucky to have Alex Collins on a team, but I don't want him. You want to trade for him? And usually the price is like a third-round pick, right? A lot of times it's, hey, I need a backup quarterback spot start. Give me a third. I need a backup running back spot start. Give me a third. And these are guys that have no value. Literally 2 weeks from then, you could drop them. But they're starting that week. You have a reason to think, hey, and this is where we get into that warp data. And I really would encourage everybody to follow AdicoFF on Twitter. I think there's an underscore. You could post the Twitter name. I'll get it to you. But he's put out a lot of these warp charts that kind of show where things flatten off. And the most common flat parts are like the RB2, high-end RB3 range. And those guys are usually in your lineups weekly. But they don't matter. They literally do not matter. So if I tell you we have a 15-week fantasy regular season and you have to start 2 running backs in your league, that is 30 trigger points or 30 starts you need to find during the season. And you know how easy those are to find in the moment, in the week, if you're willing to sit there and grind a trade with somebody for a third-round pick for Alex Collins. That's literally what is 1 out of 30? That's like, what, 3.5%? You've literally just achieved 3.5% of your objective that you may get. Let me ask you this. Name an RB2, Mason. Name a guy you're really confident is just going to be like RB15.
Travis Etienne.
Okay, Travis Etienne. You've basically just accomplished 4% of Travis Etienne's output. And it's not even 4% because Travis Etienne's not going to be an RB2 15 weeks, is he?
Yeah.
He might do it 7 weeks, 8 weeks, something like that. So by literally just buying this spot start running back, and it may not work. They don't always, achieve what Travis Etienne would be. They don't always hit like top 24 production. But a lot of times, if you can tell me I can project this player to get 16 touches, there's a very good chance he can hit like 12 points per game-ish in a week. So I've literally just accomplished 12% of Travis Etienne, in theory, if you're following me, by literally freeing up a roster spot, casting a wide net with a bunch of these running backs. Maybe I hit on a few. And the goal is that I have a lot more of them on my roster to begin with. But the other thing with the liquidation is, man, if I can leave my offseason with 5 extra third-round picks, I'm pretty confident in the right league that I may be able to fill like half of Travis Etienne's RB2 production by just trading those thirds in season. And I know I'm literally buying the points and I'm getting no ROI on the player. The player's dead. A lot of times these players are guys that you're going to want to recycle over and over and over and over. But in a week, and people just don't think about it that way. So this is like liquidation season, man. Like this is why I'm going through with how much we don't know with what's going on right now in May. I'm okay accumulating picks where I can, like grinding on the very edges of my rosters, being like, yeah, I don't care. Sure. You want to give me a third for Kendrick Bourne or someone like that? Sure. I'll take the third. Because I believe the ROI I'm going to get if I can buy one spot start, either at a backup quarterback or a running back, is way higher than me ever feeling confident putting Kendrick Bourne in a lineup. And this is in a lineup league, obviously. But he's never going to make my lineup. The odds that I hit the right week to start him and he produces as like a wide receiver 3 is so much lower than what I can buy with a third-round pick in the season. So hopefully that articulates like the strategy, but it's literally just doing this on a macro level. And there's very few players outside of like your thresholds of where you have these lineup spots that are going to fit. Like you really could go through your team and I could be like, yeah, half these players could probably go if you can turn the roster spot and maybe return this type of value.
Awesome. Well, let's just recap it for everyone because we are all over the place. Right now, yes. You don't need backup quarterbacks. You don't need extremely deep wide receivers. You need to instead use those roster spots. Go grab, I don't want to say bad running backs, but a million probably bad running backs hoping that you find a couple bad running backs that fall into opportunity during the season, and we can use the training camp reports. We can use the official depth charts at the end of the season to help us know which of those players may actually have a shot. And then we can recycle some of those roster spots back to potentially, not saying you have to, back to the backup quarterback you were wanting to roster or the backup wide receiver you were wanting to roster.